Have you ever wondered if we truly know the real nature of Jesus, beyond traditional representations and established dogmas? There's a widespread belief that certain secrets only emerge when life is about to end, like whispers escaping from the deepest corners of the human soul. On one extraordinary occasion, it wasn't a rumor or speculation thrown into the wind like so many others, nor was it a sensational headline created by the feverish imagination of the media. This time, it was an authentic confession, spoken in a low voice with tearful eyes that could barely stay open due to the weight of emotion and exhaustion. Pope Francis, surrounded by a silence so dense it seemed to make the air itself tremble, shared words that shook even those who had never allowed faith to take root in their hearts. Jesus was not as many think, he solemnly declared. He was much more, much more. At that crucial moment, the pontiff paused meaningfully, as if carrying centuries of spiritual weight on his frail shoulders. What he was about to reveal seemed too great to be contained even by the grandest cathedrals or explained with precision in any historical council. This revelation raises fundamental questions. What did the Pope know that the rest of the world still ignores? Whether out of fear, indifference, or simply an inability to see beyond. Imagine for a moment the echo of that phrase, lost in a dimly lit room, accompanied only by the fragile sound of his labored breathing and the almost imperceptible creak of the crucifix in his trembling hand. The deep tremor of a truth long contained, guarded with an almost desperate zeal, was clearly felt. What visions were granted to him in his final years of life? What did he discover in forgotten texts, in the most ancient prayers, in the mysterious whispers of the Spirit that traverse the invisible pages of history? Today we are opening a secret door, sealed for centuries by fear and power, a door that many have tried to keep closed at all costs. What lies behind it could change forever, irreversibly, the way we look at and understand Jesus. If you love Jesus and hold gratitude for all that Pope Francis taught us through his life and faith, reflect on these words as we explore this extraordinary revelation together. It all began in a modest room in the Vatican, far from the splendor one might imagine. There were no hidden cameras or speeches prepared for posterity, just a private conversation laden with existential weight that was never meant to become public. A young priest close to the Pope was the one who heard something that night that would forever change his perspective. Holy Father, do you believe Jesus experienced human fears? The question floated in the air like invisible incense, perfuming the silence with its uncertain aroma. Pope Francis, his eyes fixed on an old worn wooden crucifix, responded with a subdued but deeply grave voice. Jesus cried inwardly much more than the Gospels show, and not just for the cross, but primarily for us. The priest was left speechless, caught between astonishment, reverence, and a reverent fear. But the Pope continued, as if needing to release a burden from his soul that he could no longer carry. I saw him in a dream, Or maybe it wasn't a dream. I felt it so real that it still hurts. Jesus looked at me and cried. What kind of revelation was this? A prophetic vision? A divine warning? The question now was no longer simply whether Jesus felt physical pain, but whether his spiritual suffering was infinitely deeper than we have ever imagined. That night, the Pope couldn't sleep. In his trembling hands, clinging to a spiritual anchor, he held a worn Bible with wrinkled, underlined, and stained pages from decades of ceaseless prayer and tireless searching. Among them, a passage haunted him like a persistent echo that refused to fade. And he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Matthew 26:37. But these weren't just cold, distant, ancient words. They were silent screams, living anguish, deep groans of suffering that seemed to pulse still in the very fabric of history. Francisco closed his eyes and relived it all with renewed intensity. In that vision, Jesus was alone in Gethsemane. But there was something more. He wasn't alone merely because of the physical absence of his sleeping and oblivious disciples. He was alone because he carried on his shoulders the broken thoughts, the unconfessed guilt, the invisible wounds of all humanity. I saw his tears, murmured the Pope, but they didn't fall to the ground. They were collected by angels trembling with pain. The confidant could barely breathe as he listened, as if each word pierced his soul. Francisco continued, almost in a faltering whisper. God showed me that each of Jesus's tears had a name, and one of them was mine. What did that mean? That our stories, our guilt, our wounds are inscribed in his sacred tears? What Francisco revealed is that Jesus didn't just die for us. He also died with us, feeling every one of our losses and anguishes. In the days that followed, driven by an internal urgency he himself struggled to understand, Francisco requested access to ancient Vatican texts, manuscripts forgotten for centuries in dusty basements, wrapped in the silence of fear and oblivion. Gospels that were never included in the official canon, letters from martyrs of the early centuries, prophetic visions sealed tight out of fear or cautious prudence dictated by apprehension. There, amid this silent and desperate search, he found something that would forever change his way of looking at Jesus. A fragment attributed to an anonymous disciple said, "The Master told us that centuries would come where the image of the Son would be distorted, that they would make him king, but forget his weeping." This phrase shook him like a silent and devastating earthquake. It wasn't heresy. It was a clear, painful, and urgent warning. Jesus didn't come to be worshipped as an emperor on an unreachable golden throne, but to be understood as a man broken with love for each of us, not as a distant God, but as a deeply wounded brother who embraced humanity until his last breaths. The Pope shared this reflection in a low voice, almost like a sigh, with his closest confidant. We've made Jesus into a motionless statue, but he continues to walk among us with dirty feet and a heart completely open, willing to break again and again out of love. It wasn't a scandal or provocation. It was a desperate plea, a sincere cry to look again at Jesus, not as an unreachable and untouchable symbol, but as the Savior who cried for each of us, who cried with each of us, feeling our own wounds in his flesh. One night, while praying in solitude in the small chapel of Santa Marta, Francisco suddenly fell to his knees. Not from illness or physical weakness, but from an invisible weight, a spiritual burden that overwhelmed him from the deepest part of his soul. "Lord, show me what I still don't understand," he whispered with a barely audible voice. And then something happened that to this day is only recounted in the private diaries of the Vatican, on pages sealed not with ink, but with silent tears. A faint, warm, but disconcerting light enveloped the place. But it wasn't a classic apparition like those described in devotional books. It was a living presence, an unquestionable certainty that could not be explained or described within the limitations of human words. The Pope saw Jesus, but not as a triumphant and glorious king. He saw him as an exhausted, bleeding, completely broken man, but with infinite tenderness in his eyes, a tenderness that pierced the soul like a silent and eternal ray. Then he heard a phrase, not in his ears as an external echo, but directly in his heart as an indelible impression. "I didn't come to be understood. I came to be accompanied." Francisco broke down in tears right there. The man who represented the entire world before God was reduced to a spiritual child before such a heart-wrenching revelation. He finally understood, with a painful clarity that burned in every fiber of his being, that his role was not simply to defend a structured religion, but to reflect a broken, wounded heart that, despite everything, continues to love, loving without measure or condition. Days later, driven by an inner need impossible to ignore, Francisco secretly convened, in the privacy of his most private quarters, 2 cardinals of absolute trust. With a trembling voice, heavy with emotion and gravity, he revealed part of his deepest and most personal spiritual experience. One of them, incredulous, pale, and visibly disturbed, asked, "Holiness, are you saying that Jesus still suffers?" The Pope, with immense seriousness and an ancient weight in his eyes, responded without hesitation. "Jesus isn't dead in the past. He lives in every current suffering. He walks silently with every mother who loses her child, with every young person who can't find purpose in life, with every person who desperately cries out to God in the silence of their room and receives no immediate answer." This vision of Jesus neither denied official dogmas nor openly contradicted them, but transcended them in a deeper and more moving way. It showed the Redeemer not only as the glorious conqueror of death, but also as the silent and suffering companion of every daily affliction, of every small death that a human being experiences on this earth. Francisco wasn't seeking to change the doctrine of the Church. He wasn't a revolutionary seeking agitation. He sought to restore the living relationship, to bring us back to the human Jesus who looks into your eyes with infinite tenderness, who stays by your side when everyone else has abandoned you, when everything seems lost. And that, without a doubt, was his greatest secret, his greatest spiritual gift. One that couldn't fit into a structured sermon or a public homily, but could in an intimate whisper between hearts willing to listen. The cardinals left that meeting with pale faces, like those who have seen something they can no longer forget or erase from their consciousness. One of them, trembling as he wrote, left a testimony on paper. The Pope spoke to us as someone who no longer fears death, but the silence left by an untold truth, a truth too alive to be buried in oblivion. That night, Francisco couldn't sleep. He stayed awake, slowly reviewing one by one every moment of his pontificate, every decision made with pain or hope, every mistake committed, every prayer launched to heaven like a stifled cry. And in his heart arose a new yet ancient certainty. He had faithfully served the institutional church, but now he had to serve with every remaining fiber of his being the living Jesus, the Jesus who dwells in the flesh and tears of the forgotten. He then ordered a private letter to be written. It wasn't a solemn encyclical or a message prepared for the masses, but a personal confession, an intimate testament, a spiritual legacy intended to be opened only after his physical death. In that letter, he wrote with a steady but pained hand, Jesus didn't come for us to worship him with reverent fear. He came for us to follow him with true and committed love. We have dressed his cross in gleaming gold and forgotten the real pain he endured in his vulnerable and exposed flesh. Each word of that letter was an open wound, a silent plea launched toward hearts willing to listen, a cry for faith not to become an empty ritual, but a burning, living, and throbbing rebirth. But not everything in the Vatican was immediate acceptance. Some, fearful and conservative, saw his words as dangerous, almost subversive. He's weakening the majestic image of the Messiah, they whispered among the gilded and cold hallways. Francisco, however, knew well the truth of what he had seen and felt in the deepest part of his soul. He couldn't be silenced or chained. In an intimate mass, without cameras, without flashes or prepared speeches, in a small chapel, hidden from the world's noise, he shared a reflection that shook even in the hardest of hearts. What would happen if Jesus returned today and we didn't recognize him, because we're still waiting for the glorious King to shine in majesty, but not for the suffering brother who walks beside us in the shadows? The chapel fell into absolute silence, so profound that it seemed as though time itself had stopped, holding its breath before the magnitude of those words. Some cried in silence, others trembled without knowing exactly why, and others simply bowed their heads, trapped by a truth they didn't know how to name but could no longer ignore. But something had changed profoundly in the air, something invisible yet tangible to those who knew how to look. The Pope no longer preached from a rigid throne of authority, didn't speak from the heights of an unquestionable institution, but from the open wound of love, from the human fragility he had embraced in silence. He was planting a seed that he knew would only germinate long after his physical departure, in hearts willing to listen beyond dogma. Shortly before falling seriously ill, Francisco received the visit of a child with leukemia. It was a brief visit, planned according to the official Vatican calendar. But the encounter lasted much longer than expected. Over an hour of silent and profound communion. The child, with a timid but direct voice, as only the innocent can have, asked him with the innocence of someone unafraid of the truth, "Does Jesus' heart hurt like mine?" The Pope, with teary eyes, struggling with all his soul against the tears he could no longer fully contain, responded by leaning in so close that he almost whispered, "Yours and his beat together when you cry." After that encounter, something irreversible changed in Francisco. His homilies became slower, denser with emotion, filled with significant silences that said much more than any words. He no longer sought easy applause or expected ovations, but aimed to touch souls at their deepest root, seeking to awaken dormant hearts. And then came the silence, the gradual retreat, the quiet and resigned preparation for the inevitable that was already approaching. But even in those final days, before departing definitively, he handed a document sealed with his own handwriting to his personal secretary. A final revelation, a final flame. "This must be known when I am no longer here. Jesus will still want to keep speaking." In that document, he narrated a special night when he dreamed of Golgotha, but not as recounted in the traditional Gospels. He dreamed it as if the crucifixion were happening right now, in our days, amidst modern indifference. "I saw Jesus crucified in the middle of the city, surrounded by noise, by haste, by total indifference. But no one was looking. Everyone was too busy, passing by, submerged in their phones, hypnotized by screens that shone brighter than the stars." Then he wrote something disconcerting, almost a stifled lament. "Jesus looked at me from the cross and said, 'They didn't forget me out of ignorance. They replaced me with entertainment.'" The silence in the room was absolute when those lines were read, a thick, dense, almost painful silence. Was it a dream, a divine warning, or something even deeper that couldn't be easily explained? Because if Jesus is among us today, if he truly walks beside us, are we willing to see him again with new eyes, or have we forgotten how to look? The document also spoke of a secret prayer, a plea that the Pope prayed every dawn in absolute solitude, away from cameras, protocols, and visible rituals. It wasn't an official prayer, wasn't in any approved missal, but a sincere, naked, deeply human conversation with the Jesus he had come to know in his silent visions. It went like this: "Lord, if you were to return in flesh and blood today, would you be recognized or would you be crucified again?" It was a prayer that burned the soul, one that didn't seek comfort but raw truth, confronting head-on without allowing evasion. Francisco understood in his final days a truth that few religious leaders dare even to contemplate, that Jesus doesn't need powerful defenders or lavish altars, but humble witnesses, souls willing to share his pain. And he, in his physical weakness, in his painful and persistent illness, in his wounded humanity, had become one of them, not through power, but through pure love, through silent fidelity. His last will was clear: written in his shaky but firm handwriting. Don't remember me as the Pope. Remember the man who spoke to me through tears. Because Jesus is much closer than we think, much closer than we dare to imagine, amidst the daily noise. But he no longer speaks in thunder or visible great signs as he once did. Now he speaks in whispers, in soft murmurs that caress and pierce the soul if one dares to listen. And he added with serene conviction, listen to him before the noise of the world makes us completely deaf forever. Since then, theologians, priests, and believers from different parts of the world have tirelessly debated the contents of that sealed letter. It's the intimate legacy that doesn't seek scandal or controversy, but inner transformation, an authentic revelation, or the compassionate delirium of an old man in his final days when the veil between this world and the next becomes thinner and more transparent. For many, it remains an unfathomable mystery, but for those who truly knew him, who saw beyond protocol, beyond the white cassock and the throne of Peter, that was the moment when the Pope ceased to be an institutional figure and became something infinitely deeper. A mirror, a sharp and raw reflection of the human soul, a living reminder of our wounds and hopes. For his revelation didn't speak of the end of the world as we fear it, nor of overflowing apocalyptic catastrophes, but of something even more urgent, more necessary, the forgotten beginning of the heart, the lost root of compassion and presence. Today, that carefully guarded letter sleeps in a private vault, far from media noise and the hunger for quick news. However, some fragments have been quietly shared in small circles of authentic faith, not seeking scandal, but awakening souls, provoking inner rebirths. Because the most powerful question that emerges isn't whether Jesus spoke with Francisco, but this: is Jesus speaking to you right now, and you haven't heard him yet? Look carefully around you. Stop. Where is the deepest pain, the crying that no one sees, the heaviest silence? Where does the silent loneliness that weighs like lead on the heart hide? Precisely there. There Jesus remains present, breathing among us. Not on gleaming golden thrones or in grandiose lifeless basilicas, but in forgotten chairs, in hospital beds where invisible battles are fought, in hugs that are no longer there, in tears that are lost in the darkness without witnesses. Perhaps, just perhaps, what the Pope revealed wasn't a secret reserved for a few enlightened ones, but an eternal, simple, and powerful truth that has always been there, patiently waiting for us to finally open the ears of our souls and the eyes of our hearts. Today, more than ever, his words resonate like an echo that doesn't fade, like a whisper that travels through time. Do not worship my image. Accompany my cross. This simple yet powerful phrase encapsulates the living, beating essence of everything Francisco wanted to convey to the entire world, beyond speeches, doctrines, or theological debates. Because real, authentic Christianity isn't a religion of cold statues or soulless, repetitive rituals, but of living hearts that beat in rhythm with the suffering Master. Jesus isn't far away. He never has been. He has never stopped walking beside us. He is here now, in the labored breathing of the weary who can barely stand, in the lost and wounded gaze of the desperate who no longer know how to ask for help. In your own soul, when you cry out without words, when all that remains is the silent groan of a surrendered heart. The Pope finally understood this, not as a theological idea, but as a visceral certainty at the edge of his last breath on this earth. That's why, when his time came, he wasn't afraid to leave. Because in reality, he wasn't leaving. He was simply returning with the peace of a child to the embrace of the one who never left him alone, not even for a single moment. And you, are you also ready to set out on the path back, to let yourself be found once more? Perhaps you won't remember every exact word of this text or every detail of this shared story. It doesn't matter. You don't need to memorize everything. But if something must remain engraved in your heart like fire, like an eternal tattoo on your soul, let it be this: Jesus isn't waiting for you at cold altars or in empty liturgies. He seeks you in your darkest nights, in those corners where you think there's no hope. And if you hear him, if you truly open your soul to the whisper that pierces all silence, he will speak to you. Not in speeches, not in great thunderous revelations, but in that small voice that beats to the rhythm of your pain. What Pope Francis revealed wasn't a prophecy for some distant, uncertain, and intangible future, but an urgent revelation for the present, for this precise moment, for you here and now, wherever you are reading these words. If you've felt something move, vibrate, or awaken deep within you, as you've journeyed through this story, don't ignore it. Don't extinguish it. Don't bury it in distraction. Embrace it. Hold on to it. Because that slight tremor might just be the sign that Jesus himself is calling you, that he has been whispering your name with infinite patience, with an unwavering love that never tires of waiting. So, share this story. If you feel moved, not for me, not out of tradition or obligation, but for the one who still here and now continues to pronounce your name in the silence. Subscribe if you want to keep walking together. Comment if something has touched your life. But above all, listen. Truly listen. Because Jesus still has so much to say to you. And perhaps in that whisper, you'll find the life you've always been searching for. Until soon.